back to the short market. We're spending rather a lot of time here at the moment on Dan Really Likes Wine. Very happily so, because the menu Luke Dale Roberts has put together, it's kind of a blend of the short market as it was in Cape Town, with a very strong suggestion of the potluck club, the Asian flavors, and the result, well, the result is pretty good. And it's a result that's accentuated by some great wine, and that's exactly what we're jumping into today, with some wine I haven't had before, which is quite unusual. It is, I think, Vinum. Let's find out. Tom Pryor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Cheers. Yeah, it's Radford Dale Vinum.
All right, so Vinum. What is Vinum? It sounds slightly Latinish.
It does sound Latin. It is Latin. Actually translates to wine, which isn't so exciting.
I could probably have guessed that.
Yeah, you might have done. You might have done. But it's a range that we've had for about 20 years, and Vinum was a separate tier from Radford Dale back in the day, and as of 2017 we brought it into Radford Dale. The goal really, if you look at our tiers, you've got the Radford Dale Terroir series, which is going to be sort of single vineyards or old vines or sites of real sort of special interest. And then we have a second label or a house label, the Winery of Good Hope. But what we never had is a tier of wines that sort of sit right between the middle. And so these are very much drawing their inspiration from Radford Dale terroir vineyards. Very important components in these wines, but they're kind of geared up for that sort of by the glass listing. And
the accent I'm picking up, it's not really off the cast, doesn't sound terribly South African. What's the Tom Pryor wine story, the Tom Pryor South Africa story?
Yeah, I moved out here in 2013. Prior to that, I was living in London, but I'm from the east countryside of the UK, a place called Suffolk. And yeah, my previous career was in real estate out that way. And upon hitting 30 years old, I sort of had this epiphany that I wanted to do something else. And I'd been on holiday a few times to the Cape. As you know, you run into winemakers and see people in the industry, and I just kind of fell in love with it. And 10 years later, I'm still here, and I've been with Radford Dale for 4 years, and wine has really just kind of come on from there, really. I'm obsessed. And that's it. I'm now a permanent resident, and that's the goal.
Tell me a little bit more about the brand and the philosophy behind it.
The Radford Dale brand, I mean, we kicked off in 1998. Like a lot of the young independents we see today, it was rented cellar space. Alex Dale and Ben Radford sort of drawing, traveling the Cape, looking for sites of real interest and bringing it back to Stellenbosch base to vinify. And that was very much the model up to 2018. And in 2008, we had our head winemaker and viticulturist, Jacques de Klerk, join us. At that time, a young gun. Now he's also pushing 40, if not 40, like myself. And he's been there now 14 years. And that model carried on until 2018. Restaurant Rescue Project, it's been one of the success stories of the last couple of years, one of the few highlights of this, the challenges everyone's going through. Last year in October, we completed on the purchase of an organic wine farm in Elgin. And this represents the first winery and vineyards that we've had under ownership at Radford Dale. It's the next step up. We've always focused on natural ferments and very sort of authentic wines and sort of low intervention winemaking. But the has to come from from the site and from how you're farming. So that's a really tremendously exciting time for us. And another highlight's really been this range, Vinum. We've had to date we've had the two wines. We call them the bookends, the Chenin Blanc, Pinotage. And more recently, with this 2021 release, under the new packaging, we've got some new wines in there. So we've got the Gamay Noir, the Grenache, a Pinot Noir, and a Chardonnay. So the wines are now sort of six. And I think if you take these, this range in isolation, it really gives you the answer of what Radford Dale's all about. And Radford Dale, until that point, has been a very excited winery. We work with fruit up in the Swartland, the Black Rock wine since 23. We've long championed the merits of Pinot Noir from Elgin, and our other sort of hunting ground is very much coastal Stellenbosch around the Polka Dry slopes, etc. But if you look at this range, we've got a Chenin Blanc, a Chardonnay. Again, Alex's heritage. He grew up in Burgundy before moving out to the Cape, so he's very fanatical about those kind of wines. And then the other thing we really is light, refreshing reds, and I think Gamay is kind of the epitome of that. So I brought along today Chenin Blanc, sort of our longest standing wine in this tier, and then a new Gamay.
Tell me what I'm getting in this wine. What makes it stand out for you?
Well, I mean, the first thing to know about this wine is, when I talk about how Radford Dale Vinum is sort of intrinsically linked to the Terroir series, we have a site in the Polka Dry Oh, that's quite loud. Yeah, the wines are very linked. We've got a vineyard that we've worked with since 2008 in coastal Stellenbosch. We call it the Renaissance Vineyard. It's a vineyard that was planted in 1969, very much a heritage block. But it's quite a large single vineyard. It's about 4 hectares, and there's lots of slopes and different levels of topsoil and different amounts of foliage. So we do quite a few pickings of that site. And that wine supplies our Renaissance Chenin Blanc, our flagship, if you like. And it's quite indicative of what's been happening with Chenin Blanc. You know, that vineyard, the fruit from that vineyard was being sold to a co-op, and it was quite dilapidated and not great. So the team led by Jacques, you know, they rehabilitated that site over 5 years, and every year they learned something different about it. And so actually the core of this wine is also fruit coming from that Renaissance vineyard, so about 40%. And then there's a couple of other vineyards, one on the farm in Stellenbosch where we are, and another one on the Polkadrij Hills that we sort of combine. And that Renaissance component in this wine is also the component that's going into barrel, but fairly neutral barrels. Quite lazy winemaking. It sits in fairly neutral vessels for about 10 months. Sits there on the lease. We don't rack it off. But also not working it too hard. We're not much batonnage. We're looking for, particularly in this sort of coastal side of Stellenbosch, we're looking for sort of that citrus as a core, maybe green fruit. But also, you know, it's quite surprising just how filling and sort of leveled this wine is. It's coming in at 12% alcohol. That gives you a clue that we haven't adjusted that acid at a later date. It gives you a clue that we've done multiple pickings, and there's a lot going on. There's even a little portion of this wine that's a skin contact component. And so there we're looking again for that kind of texture, that kind of pithy character. And I think that's kind of how you define a little bit Polkadrij, that sort of green fruits. If you go over the hill into Bottleray, you're starting to see a bit more yellow fruit in the Chenins, and sometimes a bit more of a coating mouthfeel. And then I like to think of the Swartland as being more, as a sweeping statement, more around stone fruit and a salty character. And I think it's quite a nice way to sort of try and dig into the different styles.
It is one of our 2 wines. It's as you say, at 12% alcohol. Normally you'd expect, we're drinking red as well, that'll be far more alcohol, but it's not. In fact, it's 0.5% less, which is a style of wine I think we're seeing a lot more of, people making more lighter reds, and reds that are not the big, heavy behemoths that we've often had in the past. And it is a grape we don't see a huge amount of. It's the quieter side of Burgundy. Give me the Gamay story here.
Oof, I mean, I don't know how far back you want to go. We can start in the 14th century. I mean, Gamay is the grape of Beaujolais. Back in the 14th century, there was a Duke of Burgundy, I think his name was Philip the Bold. And he was looking at Burgundy, and he decided he didn't like Gamay, so he famously labelled it as very bad and disloyal, and banished it further south to Beaujolais. And Beaujolais is administratively, admin-wise, it's part of Burgundy, but it's much closer to the Rhone. And it kind of ended up there, and and Beaujolais is becoming very trendy again. So I think since the financial crisis of 2008, particularly the European sommelier circuit, the American sommeliers, they've really driven home this idea of Beaujolais as a pairing. And of course, largely in part of, bankers weren't going out for 10-course dinners anymore, and Burgundy prices were continuing to go through the roof. They were looking for another style, another kind of fresh, interesting wine. Paired menus, and we're starting to see that now, I think, in the Cape, in Gauteng. Commonly you'll see, if you're lucky enough to go for quite an eccentric 10-course pairing, you'll often see that big wine paired for the main dish. And Gamay is one of those varieties that it's a great drinking wine as well. It's a great pairing wine, but it's one of those wines that kind of invigorates the palate and keeps things going. In the Cape, the history is much more recent, but if you dial back to the 50s, 60s, it was fairly well planted in the Cape, in Stellenbosch. And of course, this kind of predates Pinot Noir finding a home in the Hemlinada and more recently Elgin. And producers like Marathi were blending it with Pinot Noir. Alphen had it with Cabernet, I think, in Pinot Noir. And you can imagine what it would lend to the blend. Very much like Cinsault, it would give that freshness, that acid, etc. So that's kind of the history. But for whatever reason, it lost favour. And I think today there are less than 10 hectares of Gamay remaining in the Cape. With Alex Dale coming out of Burgundy to South Africa in the late 90s, the first thing he wanted to do was continue importing his mate's wines, which included Burgundy and a pretty solid Beaujolais selection. When we discovered that there was some Gamay remaining in the Cape, he jumped on the chance to sort of salvage what remained of it, which I think there's 2 or 3 vineyards. And since 2014, we've had a wine called Thirst Gamay, which has been a lot of fun. It's got quite a quirky label, straight to tank, straight to bottle, smash it down. A vin soif, as the French would say. And then more recently in 2017, we released the Antidote Gamay Noir from the oldest block, I think 22 years old. And our attempt, I guess, at more of a village level wine, something a bit more serious, matured in Foudre. But again, there was this kind of gap. And, if the last 8 years have been about salvaging what remained of Gamay vineyards, then a few years ago we also did something quite extraordinary. We also planted Gamay. So it's the first planting of Gamay in 20 years, and we found a wonderful farm in the Polkadry Hills to establish it, only half a hectare. That was in 2017, I think. And then a couple of years ago we planted another almost half hectare of Gamay. So that's quite exciting for us. And if you look at the Polkadry, like Gruyère Arts would say, this is a vineyard by design. This is finally like a Gamay vineyard that kind of has been planted in a site that we believe has great potential for it. And if you look at the best spots in Beaujolais, in the northern side of Beaujolais, the cruise sites, they're all kind of situated on these granite formed hills. And what do we have in the Cape? We have wonderful granite, and the Polkadry is a great idea. So, and for early ripening reds, the granite soils in the Polkadry are quite young, so it retains a lot of warmth. And then it's quite close to False Bay, so you've got that maritime influence. And we know that some great Syrahs coming out of there, like Sons of Sugarland, or some Cabernet Francs from Logrenberg. And we know that Chenin and Chardonnay works very well, ourselves and the Alites and the Cravens, for example. And so that's where we've identified some prospects for Gamay. We've been really thrilled by that vineyard to date. So this, as of 2021, is a 4-year-old Gamay vineyard. And so, if Chenin Blanc's now had a good run with Vinum, then this and the Grenache and the Pinot Noir, they're all about potential, and what's next. More excitingly than that, we've also, this will now serve as the mother block. We're going to take material from this vineyard, and later this year we'll be planting it on the new farm in Elgin. So, hopefully in a few years we'll have an organic Elgin Gamay Noir. And later than that, we hope to be able to supply other producers. There's a lot of interest from peers, and I think, this drinking trend and style is coming back towards strained alcohol, fresh red wines, and we've always loved those, but it seems to be now coming forward. So this is the next part of our Gamay project.
That's driving the Radford Dale story. You've had an exclusive audience with wine history professor Tom Pryor running us through the Radford Dale story, the Vinum. I think most excitingly the Gamay. There's a good chance you've never had Gamay before, or certainly not knowingly. Seek it out, give it a try. It's a little slice of quiet Burgundy in South Africa, and it's in very good hands, the team at Radford Dale.